like I and my dog have to say something about, well, you know who. I mean, if you read the Mad Sociologist blog, which you should, because it's awesome, then you know that I've made it my policy to not spend time riffing about the Orange Don. After all, what is there to say? He's corrupt, he's a liar, he's incompetent, he's a bigot. That pretty much covers it. Anything else I might say would only be an elaboration of those themes. On the other hand, I can't very well have a feature called Mad Sociologist in the News and not cover a historical event like the impeachment of an American president. So I'm stuck. But not to worry, I'm still going to hold to what I think should be the fundamental rule for commentary in the age of Trump. That is, it's not about Trump. It's never about Trump. No matter what it is, it's not about Trump. Trump is like the oozing red pustule on the surface of an underlying infection. It's what we talk about because it's what we see. He's a glaringly obvious, itchy, burny blemish that mars everything around him. But if we treat the boil without dealing with the underlying infection, we'll only end up with another boil, perhaps an even bigger boil, or a more competent boil. Maybe even a right-wing evangelical boil with executive experience and functional political skills. Just saying. To deal with the boil, we have to get at the head. We have to get at the underlying infection, of which impeachment may be a part of the solution, unless it isn't. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So what do we know so far? We know that the president violated campaign finance law by failing to report an in-kind contribution in the form of a payoff to an actress and to a model with whom he's alleged to have had affairs. We know that there are serious financial discrepancies regarding his inaugural expenditures. We know that he has likely violated the Emoluments Clause of the United States Constitution by failing to place his assets in a blind trust and by allowing his company to continue to do business in foreign nations and to accept money from foreign officials. We know that members of his family directly benefit from his presidency and from their nepotistic roles within the United States government. We know that taxpayers foot the bill for Trump and his staff to vacation at his own properties and clubs that become more lucrative by virtue of the president's status. We know that he has illegally diverted funds from his charity foundation for personal and political use. We know that he has used the power of his office to pursue personal vendettas with Amazon founder Jeff Bezos and CNN. We know that the president continues to violate both the 1967 UN Protocols on Refugees and the 1980 Refugee Act, and arguably is complicit in committing crimes against humanity with his cruel and racist border policies, as well as his support for human rights violations in Yemen. We know from the Mueller report that though collusion is not really a legal thing, and there's not enough evidence of conspiracy on the part of the Trump campaign in the Russia hacking scandal, it's clear that Trump and his cronies are willing to accept dubious foreign assistance in pursuit of his personal interests, because he himself said so. We know that when investigated, the president actively engaged in clear instances of obstruction of justice, more than 10 of which are outlined in the Mueller report. This includes the firing of Director James Comey, to which he admitted on national television was motivated by the Russia investigation. We know that he has illegally withheld necessary aid to Puerto Rico after American citizens there were hit by 2 hurricanes and a recent series of earthquakes. We know that the president has launched military actions against Syria and Yemen without congressional approval. Most recently, the president ordered the targeted killing of a foreign military official, but is unwilling to provide Congress with the legal rationale for what is arguably an assassination. We know that the president has surrounded himself with pretty questionable people, dozens of whom have received over 100 charges, all told. Those convicted include Trump campaign manager Paul Manafort, political advisor Roger Stone, foreign policy advisor George Papadopoulos, security advisor Michael Flynn, and personal attorney and fixer Michael Cohen. Fixer? Really? He has a fixer? And then there's the lies. Oh my God, the endless stream of lies and obfuscations that are almost impossible to keep track of. I don't know if lies by themselves are impeachable, but maybe there should be some kind of standard. Regardless of how one might feel about any of the above, it's clear that there's more than enough reason to impeach the president, if not to completely remove him from office. So the House had plenty of ammunition to file articles of impeachment. Wait, what? What? None of them? He wasn't impeached on any of those. I haven't even touched on... Oh, God. Oh, my God. So, it turns out that the House of Representatives decided to focus on two violations that it considers qualifies as bribery and high crimes and misdemeanors. First, the House is claiming that President Trump abused the power of his office by illegally withholding congressionally approved funds to the Ukraine. Here's the story. Ukraine is currently defending itself from Russia. Last year, Congress approved $400 million in aid to help Ukraine defend itself. President Trump delayed sending the congressionally approved funds when his withholding the funds was discovered and questioned. He did release them. However, a whistleblower made the claim that Trump was withholding the money for his own political gain. Congress opened up investigations into the whistleblower complaint, investigations that the administration has stonewalled from the very beginning. The most the public received from the White House was a memo of a telephone transaction between President Trump and Ukrainian President Zelensky. But even this memo, not a transcript, mind you, but a memo, was pretty damning. In the memo, President Trump asked Zelensky to open investigations into former Vice President Joe Biden regarding his son, Hunter Biden's work on the board of a Ukrainian energy company, Burisma. It sure sounded like a morally questionable quid pro quo arrangement. The White House claims that it was withholding the money in order to pressure Ukraine into cracking down on corruption, but that's not what the memo suggests. A memo put out by the White House. Except for the memo, the White House has refused to cooperate with the investigation. They have denied subpoenas for pertinent documents and have refused to allow key witnesses to testify before Congress. Regardless, investigations into the matter have revealed a very intensive campaign led by Trump's personal attorney, former New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani, to pressure Ukraine into investigating the president's presumed rival in the 2020 election, Vice President Joe Biden. Not only was the money withheld, but the president also refused a White House visit with Zelensky and refused to allow Vice President Mike Pence to attend Zelensky's inauguration. These seem like relatively minor things, but these rituals would have been a crucial sign of American support for the Ukrainian president. This support may have deterred Russia in its quest to acquire Ukrainian territory. What about the Joe Biden thing? Well, in 2014, Vice President Biden was dispatched to help Ukraine fend off an increasing threat from Russia. Russia would eventually take over the Crimea. Ukraine was in a bad way. One reason for this was the foreign countries were hesitant to do business there because of the nation's well-established corruption. Biden extolled the Ukraine to crack down on corruption. He even led a bipartisan international effort to get the Ukrainian government to fire its notoriously corrupt Prosecutor General, Viktor Shokin. Unfortunately for Biden, his son, Hunter, was given a position on the board of directors for the Ukrainian gas company, Burisma. Burisma, like many Ukrainian companies, had a long history of corruption and was under investigation while the vice president was trying to press Ukraine to crack down on corruption. That's awkward. Now, there's no evidence that Vice President Biden did anything to favor his son or did anything that was inconsistent with bipartisan approved policy. That being said, it certainly looks bad. Is it likely that Hunter Biden was brought in because of Biden's position? Sure. Maybe it's something that should be investigated. If so, then any such arrangement should also be investigated. Frankly, I'm on team investigate all politicians for everything, always. But that's just me. And my dog. Another topic that came up in the memo was the... Bless you. Another topic that came up in the memo was the CrowdStrike Ukraine conspiracy. In brief, the claim has been made that wealthy influencers in Ukraine were responsible for interfering in the 2016 election in favor of Hillary Clinton. They then framed the interference on Russia, creating a bogus Russia scandal that was the impetus of the Mueller investigation. Now, this conspiracy theory is completely bogus and thoroughly debunked, but lingers on in the White House. Regardless, Congress approved aid to a nation that desperately needed it. Lives were literally in the balance for receiving this package that was held up by the Trump administration. The president can't do that. Indeed, the Government Accountability Office has determined that President Trump broke the law in withholding the funds. Furthermore, it's clear that the administration knew it broke the law, because when the holdup was discovered, the administration then tried to find legal justifications for withholding the funds. Also, it's clear that the focus of this leverage was on digging up dirt on Vice President Biden. This is a clear conflict of interest, even if we agree that the Hunter Biden Burisma thing is questionable. Isn't that right, Falcor? Come here. Say hello. Say hello. There she is. She's such a good girl. She's such a good girl. Yes, she is. Yes, she is. So the House of Representatives has decided that the president's actions constitute an impeachable offense. On a party line vote, the House has approved 2 articles of impeachment. The first article claims that President Trump, withholding congressionally approved funds, an act that has subsequently been determined as illegal, constitutes an abuse of presidential power. The second article claims that the president's refusal to release pertinent documents and allow relevant officials to testify to Congress, as well as his threatening tweets when officials have testified, constitutes obstruction. Now, it seems pretty clear. The president did hold up the money, almost certainly for personal rather than policy reasons. His own press secretary admitted publicly that this was a quid pro quo and that they knew it to be a violation of the law. The president has also refused to cooperate with the investigation. Bam! Done and done. Well, not so fast. Remember, impeachment is not a criminal trial. It is a legislative trial to determine if an elected official should be removed from office. It's not enough to prove that the president broke the law. After all, when President Clinton was impeached, he really did break the law by lying to a grand jury, but he was not removed from office. For impeachment, it must be determined by the Senate that the president committed a high crime or misdemeanor. In Clinton's case, he did commit a crime, but this crime, according to the Senate, did not constitute a high crime or misdemeanor. That criteria does allow for a little wiggle room. And that's where things get interesting sociologically. Come here. Come here. Come here. Come. Good girl. Come here. Come here. Falcor is very, very upset about this. She's into ethics. Anyway, overall, for my purposes, the actual impeachment itself is of secondary concern. There's not much I can add to what is already out there. I'm more interested in the non-Trump elements of this process because remember, Trump is never the issue. It's never about Trump. So I'm more interested in the non-Trump elements of this process as a social phenomenon. What's interesting to me is how this impeachment process is a spotlight on the in-group, out-group dynamics of American politics, what political science folks refer to as polarization. Let's break down the sociology. We all participate in social groups. Some of these social groups are relatively small, intimate, and emotionally based, like our families or friends. These are called primary groups. We may have different identifiable family groups and friends that we have in our neighborhood, at school, at work, at church. Some groups are mid-sized, like the company we work for, the church we belong to, the town we live in. Some groups are very large, like our nation or our religion. I consider myself an American, but I don't know or even like every American. It's a really, really big group. In this case, being part of the group called American or being part of the group called Catholic is being part of what sociologists call a reference group, or a group large enough that people can make inferences about your identity based on your participation in the group. Now, people participate in all kinds of groups. In fact, forming social groups may very well be intrinsic to who we are as human beings. Some of these groups have subgroups, like you may consider yourself part of a school, but you're also part of the sociology club, and you're also part of a group of friends or a clique in school. You then belong to a workplace, but you have groups within that workplace that you align with. There's a lot of social groups that people belong to. We belong to these groups because they give us a sense of belonging, instill in us a sense of identity. They impart a certain amount of status and power, and they allow us to access resources. These resources may be material resources, but they're also cultural, social, and emotional resources. In exchange, individuals give the social groups their time, their energy, and their material and non-material resources. But individuals only have so much of these resources to give. So there are limits to our participation in social groups. Some groups are very important to us, and we give them a lot of time, energy, and resources. In this case, these groups become integral to our identities. Other groups, they're there. We find them useful, but they're ancillary to who we are. Some groups in any given society exist in conflict with each other. There are often groups that perceive that they must compete for access to resources, power, networks, or whatever. This may be a clique in school. They may be families like the Hatfields and the McCoys, or the Montagues and the Capulets. In democratic societies, a big source of conflict lies in political parties. Anytime we see groups in conflict, we see what sociologists call in-group, out-group dynamics. The group in which we're a part is our in-group, but participation in the in-group, and part of the identity that this participation imparts, rests on recognizing that the other group, the out-group, is the antagonist. Now, often this dynamic is no big deal. I'm part of the reference group called New York Yankees fans. As a member of that group, I recognize that Red Sox fans suck. But really, this is not such a big deal. I don't really have any animosity for Red Sox fans. It's just friendly competition. Sometimes this competition is more intense, but still useful. In democratic societies, different interest groups get together and form coalitions by which they try to have their interests represented. Now, this is functional because these coalitions create structural ways to deal with their differences without destabilizing the larger society. Usually. This kind of power arrangement forces groups to negotiate, compromise, and try to find some happy medium by which we all can live. This dynamic works pretty well when the parties involved are of relatively equal status and power and resources. Other times, this dynamic can be really problematic. In one instance, one particular group can become overwhelmingly powerful to the point where it no longer has to negotiate. It can just enforce its will. That's often the case in one-party states like the Soviet Union or contemporary China. In fact, it makes sense for any party to want to be a one-party state. That way they don't have to negotiate. They don't have to give up anything. In another instance, however, at least one group can decide that it's strategically more advantageous to dedicate itself to undermining the other group than it is to negotiating. This is characteristic of group closure, the unwillingness of a group to form networks or make connections with other groups. Closed groups become insular and are singularly dedicated to their own empowerment at the expense of the other group. And don't get me wrong, whenever there's a competitive group dynamic, there are examples of groups trying to undermine each other. Often, rules are put into place to mitigate this tendency, but the rules are valid only so long as all groups are willing to follow them. So one sports team is certainly going to try to find ways to undermine a competitive sports team, analyze their weaknesses, and use them for their advantage. But so long as they're following the rules, you have a game. Of course, sports teams tend to make the assumption that the other team has a legitimate right to compete. What happens when one group decides that the other group does not have a legitimate right to exist? Perhaps they define the other group not just as a collective of individuals with similar interests, but rather as a threat to the existence of the in-group. What happens if the out-group is so vilified that the in-group cannot justify negotiation? The out-group isn't just a competing interest group. It's evil. It's trying to destroy your very way of life and take away your freedoms. In that case, the in-group is justified in closing negotiations and even ignoring the established rules of the game in order to in order to undermine the out-group. That's why group closure is most characteristic of extremist political ideologies and fundamentalist religious groups. The other group is not just an interest group, but it's the enemy. It's an apostasy. It is a threat to everything we know and love. Well, that changes the dynamic. In politics, this is characteristic of polarization. Many political scientists note that we're currently living in an exceptionally polarizing time. That's what, to me, makes the impeachment process interesting. We may be looking at a natural experiment in just how polarized our nation and our political coalitions are. Look, when we participate with social groups, there's a tendency to see those associated with our in-group as being more deserving of respect and the benefit of the doubt than those associated with the out-group. When someone within our in-group is challenged, we tend to see this challenge as an illegitimate attack. When those in the out-group are challenged, we tend to assume that the challenge is valid and legitimate. This is a normal part of being a human. It's called in-group bias. But in-group bias isn't absolute. Like I said earlier, we participate in a lot of groups. Each of these groups has some influence on our identities. So our participation in a political group may influence our perspective when we participate in our groups at work or church. We have a lot of influences. We might hypothesize that our emotional integration within a group is directly proportional to the level of in-group bias we might have. So, for instance, in the 1970s, there was a lot of pressure on Republicans to support the president, Republican Richard Nixon. Most of them did, right up to the very end. But the evidence kept mounting against him. Some of that evidence was uncovered by other Republicans on the committee. Consequently, when articles of impeachment were voted on in the Judiciary Committee in 1974, 6 and 7 Republicans voted in favor of impeachment on the first 2 articles respectively. Nixon resigned before he could be formally impeached, but A similar pattern was demonstrated in the 1990s with President Clinton when articles of impeachment were voted on. 5 Democrats voted in favor of impeachment on the first 3 articles. After the Senate trial, Clinton was saved from being removed by Republicans who crossed the aisle and voted against removal. So party loyalty usually only goes so far. At least it used to. What about now? Well, as usual, there's a backstory. In 2008, the Republican Party was up against the ropes. Things turned pretty sour for the United States in the opening decade of the 21st century, years that corresponded with almost total conservative Republican governments. By 2008, the United States was quagmired in 2 foreign wars and facing an economic collapse. Republicans had already suffered devastating political losses in 2006. This was compounded when a one-term senator, Barack Obama, overwhelmingly defeated his more experienced rival and war hero, John McCain. Furthermore, Obama came to office with a clear and ultimately veto-proof Democratic control of Congress. Things weren't looking good for the Republican Party. In 2009, top Republicans met at the Caucus Room Inn to hash out a strategy. The strategy was simple: obstruct everything. The Republican Party believed that the best strategy was not politics as usual, come to the table, negotiate, compromise, see what you can get to represent your interests. No, the GOP dedicated itself to undermining President Obama at every turn. Mitch McConnell said it best when he openly admitted that his #1 priority was to make Barack Obama a one-term president. We thought the #1 priority of a senator was to represent your constituents. Well, never mind that. This led to some interesting moments. There was the time President Obama came up in support of a Republican proposal, and the 7 Republicans who drafted the bill withdrew their support. There was the time John McCain voted against his own legislation after President Obama announced his support. It was just weird. Now, remember, to justify this strategy, the in-group, in this case the Republican Party and its constituents, can't see the out-group as having a legitimate claim to its position. After all, President Obama was overwhelmingly elected and re-elected. No, President Obama and the Democratic Party had to be represented as a dangerous enemy. Secondly, this strategy required a tremendous amount of intra-group discipline. After all, there were plenty of opportunities for bipartisan agreement. During the healthcare debate, the president asked conservative Democrat Ben Nelson to lead a bipartisan panel with an equal number of Republicans and Democrats to hammer out a healthcare reform proposal. Obama didn't have to do this. He had a reform bill from the House that included a public option, a very popular public buy-in plan, and he had a veto-proof majority in the Senate. The final bill that was presented was very similar to the Republican healthcare reform proposal offered in the 90s and developed by the conservative think tank, the Heritage Foundation. One would think that plenty of Republicans would be willing to vote for it, even if it meant having to accept some progressive ideas like expanded Medicaid. After all, that's how politics works. My group gets a little and sacrifices a little, your group gets a little and sacrifices a little, but we move forward. Nope, not a single Republican signed on. Period. Problem is, it worked. The unrelenting attacks against Democrats and the blatant obstruction, as well as the mobilization of conservative mass movements at the base, robbed Obama and the Democratic Party of a great deal of political capital. In January of 2010, just a year after his inauguration, Obama lost his veto-proof majority in the Senate when Republican Scott Brown was elected to replace the late Ted Kennedy in Massachusetts. That's right, liberal Ted Kennedy's seat was taken by a conservative Republican in Massachusetts. That was only a portent of the shellacking Democrats received less than a year later in the 2010 election. The 2010 election was a watershed for the Republican group dynamics. First, it legitimized the Republican obstructionist strategy. It was clear that not working with the other party, the out-group, was a viable strategy for the Republican Party. Secondly, it galvanized and mobilized the conservative base. Conservatism as a social and political movement had been ascendant in the Republican Party since the rise of Barry Goldwater. Conservatives became the dominant coalition in the Republican Party in the 1980s. The 2010 election was a lock for conservative ideology in the Republican Party, to the point where former Massachusetts Governor Mitt Romney, a notable Republican moderate, had a hard time convincing Republicans that he was a severe conservative. Republican moderates became an endangered species. Even some Republican conservatives like Eric Cantor and Paul Ryan ended up losing their status when it was decided that even they, the young guns of the conservative movement, weren't conservative enough. Consequently, the Republican Party moving into 2016 was a far more homogeneously conservative, white Christian party than it had ever been. When social groups are homogenous, it's much easier for them to become closed, insular, and protected from outside influences. So how does this more homogenous, more closed, more disciplined group dynamic play out in our current impeachment debate? Well, that remains to be seen. As of the time of this video was being drafted, the impeachment was still being heard in the Senate. Both sides are currently giving their arguments. The latest news as of right this moment is that information leaked from a forthcoming book by former National Security Advisor John Bolton further confirms that the president was withholding funding contingent upon Ukraine investigating Joe Biden. Yet another witness contradicting the claim that the president was merely trying to get the Ukrainian government to address corruption more broadly. However, we can predict that it will be far more difficult to get the more homogenous and closed Republican Party to turn against President Trump than, say, the more heterogeneous party that had Nixon's back. When Trump ran in 2016, many Republicans made the claim that they did not like what he stood for, but they voted for him because Hillary was the Antichrist or some version of that theme. Remember, outgroups. But now that Hillary is off the stage, Donald Trump, a man with a long history of corruption, public spectacle, and scandal, still holds a solid 88% approval rating among Republicans, even in the face of impeachment. To put this in perspective, President Richard Nixon had a similar approval rating, peaking at 90% in February of 1973. His approval then plummeted after guilty pleas started to pile up from the Watergate investigation. Nixon hadn't been impeached yet, but his approval collapsed to just over 50% among Republicans just 7 months later. Trump has faced multiple scandals, far beyond anything faced by Nixon, but his numbers haven't budged. Trump is facing impeachment more analogous to Bill Clinton, who remained popular among Democrats despite impeachment. Clinton was ultimately acquitted by the Senate. That's a good sign for Trump supporters. But it even goes beyond that. As it stands, the Republican Party, under the leadership of Mitch McConnell, appear determined to assist the White House in their willingness to stonewall the impeachment process. I'm not just saying that. Mitch McConnell himself said that the Senate leadership is going to conduct the impeachment trial in lockstep with the Trump administration, that there's no distance between Senate Republicans and the White House. McConnell is advocating a quick trial without witnesses or the admission of critical evidence. How is that even possible? Or even acceptable? But it is acceptable. If it weren't, we should see approval numbers more like Nixon. Forming judgments without a look at the evidence or hearing arguments or points of view from relevant others is emblematic of in-group dynamics. Okay, Andosha, but what about Democrats and liberals? Could it be that the same in-group biases that you're pointing out from the Republicans is also true of the Democrats and that they're equally biased toward Trump's removal from office? Yeah, that's perfectly reasonable to assume. There's nothing special about Democrats that saves them from the same in-group biases as the Republicans. We all have to be wary of our in-group biases. The prevailing research does suggest that these in-group biases are innate elements of human nature. They may be innate, but they're not immutable. There are some ways to protect yourself from in-group biases. First, you can participate in many diverse groups. The more groups that you're a part of, that you incorporate into your identity, the less emotional or social investment you have in any one group. That's why political partisans are especially susceptible to in-group bias. The amount of investment they put into their party is high, meaning the party identity is more intimately integrated into their own identity. An attack against the party is an attack against them. Secondly, make sure that the groups you participate in are as diverse as possible and that they have as many bridges with other groups as possible. People who interact between groups are called bridges. Bridges poke holes in closed groups, and as groups become more closed, they do so by eliminating the bridges. In some ways, this is an advantage that the Democrats have over the Republicans at this point, as the Democratic Party today has a greater diversity of coalitions within the party influencing its direction, from leftists like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to conservatives like Joe Manchin and moderates like Joe Biden. The Democratic Party is also home to a greater density of women, people of color, and alternative sexualities. Thirdly, listen to those in the out-group and assume that they're good people with whom you may disagree. You know, Red Sox fans are all right. No, really. Here's the thing. The folks in the out-group are probably not Hitler. Unless the out-group really are Nazis, then, you know. If what you're hearing from your in-group is that the out-group is out to destroy everything that you know or love, that's probably not true. Even global warming deniers are denying global warming not because they want to destroy the world, but because they've not been convinced by the evidence, or they believe there are other priorities. They're not evil monsters who want the world to burn. So how about listening to what they have to say? Fourthly, establish a criteria for making judgments about the things that are important to you. Then judge actions according to those criteria rather than what your group believes to be true. For instance, I believe that blowing people up using flying killer robots is bad. It's bad when Trump does it. It was bad when Obama did it. It will be bad when the next president does it, no matter what party they belong to. I will protest that because that's the minimum criteria I have in this regard. When you set this criteria, remember that's the criteria that is acceptable to you. It's universal. If you decide that it is perfectly appropriate to conduct an impeachment trial without calling witnesses or without examining the evidence, then that's your standard. If the next president is a Democrat and they face impeachment, you can't turn around and demand witnesses be called and evidence gathered. Yeah, you can change your mind. I've changed my mind about a lot of things. But when I do, I have to admit that I was wrong. It still discredits my position. Finally, become acquainted with scientific methods of deductive and inductive testing and use them on yourself when you form a judgment. Social scientists have, for decades, had to contend with in-group biases while studying society and individuals. They've come up with some interesting practices and discipline to help them control for and confront bias. One discipline that I use is when I form a judgment, I ask myself, what does the world look like if I'm wrong? I then go out and try to find that evidence. If I can find that evidence, then it's likely I'm wrong in some way. Maybe I need to abandon that judgment. Maybe I need to modify the account for new data. Either way, I can't see the world as I had before. I have to change. Most importantly, when the data contradict even your most cherished beliefs, you have to find the discipline to accept the data and modify your beliefs. Look, I get it. It sucks when a member of your in-group, especially someone you've put your own reputation on the line to support, comes up wanting. Progressives were huge fans of Anthony Weiner until, you know. Many even stuck by him until the evidence started adding up. Al Franken was a hugely popular progressive politician, but now he's gone. These are heartbreaking setbacks for progressive, but it happens. The larger your group, the more likely that someone in it will betray its underlying principles. How you respond to these betrayals is a measure of how important those principles are. Group members have to balance two competing forces. On one hand are the principles that legitimize the existence of the group. On the other hand is the status that legitimizes the power of that group. Support for Trump means rejection of the expressed principles of the Republican Party, but may, at least in the short term, sustain its power. Rejection of Trump's clear abuse of power means taking a short-term hit to the status of the group, but preserves the unifying principles. It really isn't an easy choice, but the stakes are high. By defending Trump, we take the chance of normalizing his actions. We're saying that defying Congress and using the office of the president as a prop to extract favors is okay. We're saying that if he has enough votes in Congress, then the president is above the law. The larger group in which we identify as Americans holds to the values that nobody should be above the law. Are these principles worth sacrificing? For that guy. The ball's in your court, Republicans. But remember, you are going to be signing your name in terms of a vote on removal from office. That's going to stand the test of history. So I want to offer a bit of an end note. When I started making this video, the impeachment trial was still going on, but it finished before I had a chance to finish the video. Yeah, look, I know. I have a day job, folks. Give me a break. Anyway, we know the results of this quasi-experiment, and they largely confirm the sociology. The actual facts of the case meant very little. Democrats voted for removal. Republicans voted for acquittal. This is consistent with the history of presidential impeachments. We may have examples of individuals crossing party lines to acquit, such as Republicans who crossed the party line to acquit President Clinton. But we've never seen an example of someone crossing party lines to remove a president. Until now. Republican Mitt Romney is the only person in history to remove a sitting president of his own party. Wow. Why would that happen? Well, Romney explained that he made his decision based not on his group membership in the Republican Party, but based on his group identity as a Christian. His standing as a Christian required him to take his oath before God seriously and judge the case on its merits, which, when it came to Trump's abuse of power, he felt the case was effectively made. Like I said, participation and investment in more than one group is a guardrail against in-group bias. I said from the beginning, this is not about Trump. I just didn't realize that it would be about Mitt Romney. We're living history, folks.